The gunshot echoed across the Montana plains like thunder, spurring Grace Jennings to run faster than she'd ever run before. Blood from a graze wound trickled down her arm as the early morning sun cast long shadows through the tall prairie grass of 1878. Behind her, her father's drunken shouts carried on the wind, promising pain if he caught her. She'd endured his beatings for 21 years, but when he'd aimed his pistol at her in a whiskey-fueled rage, something inside Grace had finally broken. She would rather die on her own terms than beneath his fists. Grace's lungs burned as she pushed deeper into unknown territory, her thin cotton dress snagging on brush and thorns. The homestead disappeared behind her, but she could still hear hoofbeats in the distance. Her brothers would be coming after her soon. They always did her father's bidding, cowed by his violence or embracing it themselves. The family's reputation in the nearby town of Willow Creek was fearsome. The Jennings men were known for their cruelty and quick tempers. Desperate for cover, Grace veered toward a cluster of cottonwood trees near a bend in the river. Her long auburn hair had come loose from its pins, whipping across her face as she ran. The morning dew soaked her worn boots and the hem of her dress, adding weight to her already exhausted limbs. "You ungrateful girl." Her father's voice carried over the plain. "After all I done for you, your mother would be ashamed." Tears stung Grace's eyes. Her mother had died giving birth to a stillborn brother when Grace was 12, leaving her alone to endure her father's escalating abuse. Each year grew worse, especially after her 18th birthday, when he'd begun threatening to marry her off to one of his gambling associates, old men with hard eyes who looked at her like she was livestock. The sounds of pursuit grew louder. Grace pushed through a thicket of brush, emerging onto what looked like solid ground covered with short grass. Relief flooded through her at the sight of the dense trees just ahead. If she could reach them, she might find somewhere to hide. Her foot sank unexpectedly, throwing her off balance. Confused, Grace tried to pull free, but her leg was caught in something wet and thick. With growing horror, she realized the ground beneath her wasn't solid at all. What had seemed like firm earth was actually a sand pit near the river's edge, cleverly disguised by a thin layer of vegetation. "Help!" she cried out instinctively, then immediately regretted it. If her family heard her, they'd find her trapped and defenseless. But the alternative was sinking into the earth, being swallowed alive by the quicksand that now had her firmly in its grip. Grace struggled, but each movement only seemed to pull her deeper. The sand had claimed her up to her knees now, cold and unyielding. She clawed at the ground around her, searching for anything solid to grab onto, but only succeeded in disturbing more of the treacherous surface. The distant sound of hoofbeats suddenly changed direction. They had heard her cry. Panic seized Grace's heart. Perhaps the quicksand was preferable to what awaited her at home. Her father had been in one of his worst moods, and the bullet graze on her arm proved he wasn't making idle threats this time. "Whoa there! Don't move, miss." The voice came from behind her, deep and unfamiliar. Grace twisted her head to see a tall figure on horseback emerging from the tree line. For a terrible moment, she thought it might be one of her brothers, but this man was a stranger, broad-shouldered with a weathered face partially shadowed by his wide-brimmed hat. "I'm caught," Grace called out, desperation in her voice. "Please help me." The man dismounted in one fluid motion, tying his horse to a nearby branch before approaching cautiously. "Don't struggle," he instructed, surveying the situation with calm, experienced eyes. "The more you fight it, the faster you'll sink." He removed his leather vest and retrieved a rope from his saddle. Grace watched him work with quick, efficient movements, all while the quicksand continued to pull at her legs, now reaching her thighs. "My name's Ryan Abernathy," he said, clearly trying to keep her calm as he fashioned a loop in the rope. "I'm going to toss this to you. Put it under your arms, and I'll pull you free. But you need to stay as still as possible." Grace nodded, trying to steady her breathing. Ryan tossed the loop, and it landed perfectly within her reach. With trembling hands, she slipped it over her head and worked it beneath her arms. "Good," Ryan said. "Now, I need you to lean back slightly and stay flat. When I pull, try to keep your legs loose. The sand will release you more easily that way." He wrapped the rope around his torso and braced himself against the trunk of a stout tree. With methodical strength, Ryan began to pull. Grace felt the quicksand reluctantly releasing its grip as she was gradually dragged backward. The suction created a powerful resistance, but Ryan didn't relent. His face strained with effort, muscles in his forearms standing out like cords. After what seemed like an eternity, Grace felt her legs break free. With one final heave, Ryan pulled her completely onto solid ground. She lay there gasping, covered in wet sand but alive. "Thank you," she managed between breaths. Ryan was already kneeling beside her, examining her for injuries. His eyes widened at the sight of blood on her arm. "You're hurt." "It's just a graze," Grace said, suddenly remembering her pursuers. She twisted to look back across the plains. "Please, I need to keep moving. My family, they're coming after me." Ryan followed her gaze, then looked back at her with newfound understanding in his eyes. "Your family did this to you?" Before Grace could answer, the distant sound of voices carried on the wind. Her father's unmistakable bellow made her flinch. "Please," she whispered. "If they find me." Ryan didn't hesitate. He helped her to her feet and guided her toward his horse. "I've got a cabin about 2 miles from here. Can you ride?" Grace nodded, though in truth she hadn't been on a horse in years. Her father had sold hers long ago to pay gambling debts. With surprising gentleness for his size, Ryan helped her onto his chestnut stallion, then swung up behind her. "Hold on tight," he instructed, reaching around her to grab the reins. The horse responded immediately to his commands, setting off at a brisk pace through the trees, away from the pursuing voices. Grace was acutely aware of the stranger's strong presence behind her, his chest solid against her back as they rode. Fear and exhaustion competed with the strange sense of security she felt in his protection. She had never trusted a man outside her family, and even those within it had betrayed that trust repeatedly. Yet something about Ryan Abernathy's calm confidence made her believe she might be safe, at least for now. They rode in silence through a winding path in the woods, the horse seeming to know the way without much guidance. Ryan kept them under the cover of trees, occasionally stopping to listen for pursuit, but the sounds of her family grew more distant. Finally, they emerged into a small clearing where a modest but well-maintained cabin stood. A corral to one side held 2 more horses, and smoke curled lazily from the chimney. "My place," Ryan said simply, dismounting and reaching up to help Grace down. Now that they were safe, at least temporarily, Grace felt the last of her adrenaline fading. Her legs buckled as her feet touched the ground, and Ryan caught her before she could fall. "Easy there," he said, concern evident in his voice. "Let's get you inside." The cabin was neat and surprisingly comfortable inside. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the single room was organized with military precision. A bed occupied one corner, a small table and 2 chairs another. Shelves lined with books suggested Ryan Abernathy was more than just a simple cowboy. He helped her to one of the chairs, then moved to a trunk near the bed, retrieving a small medical kit. "We should clean that wound," he said, nodding toward her bloodied arm. Grace instinctively pulled her arm closer to her body, a protective gesture born from years of conditioning. Ryan noticed her reaction and stepped back slightly, giving her space. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. "But that needs tending, or it might fester." "Why are you helping me?" Grace asked, finally voicing the question that had been on her mind since he'd appeared by the quicksand. Ryan's expression was solemn. "Because you needed help," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "and because I've seen what men like your father can do. No one deserves that." Something in his tone told Grace he wasn't speaking in generalities. There was personal knowledge behind his words, a shared understanding of suffering. Slowly, she extended her arm. Ryan worked with gentle efficiency, cleaning the bullet graze with water and whiskey, which stung fiercely but cleaned the wound. His fingers were calloused but deft, and he apologized whenever she winced. "You're lucky," he said as he wrapped a clean bandage around her arm. "Another inch to the right, and we'd be digging out a bullet." "It wasn't luck," Grace replied quietly. "He missed on purpose. He always does. It's his way of showing what could happen if I ever tried to leave." Ryan's jaw tightened, but he didn't comment. Instead, he moved to the small stove in the corner and poured coffee from a pot into 2 tin cups. He handed one to Grace, along with a piece of cornbread from a covered plate. "Eat something," he urged. "Then we can talk about what comes next." Grace accepted the food gratefully, realizing she hadn't eaten since the previous day. The cornbread was surprisingly good, slightly sweet, and still warm. She took a cautious sip of the coffee, finding it strong but comforting. Ryan sat across from her, giving her time to eat without interrogation. His patience was unlike anything Grace had experienced from a man. In her household, meals were rushed affairs, punctuated by her father's complaints and demands. "Thank you," she said when she'd finished. "For everything. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." "What's your name?" Ryan asked, his voice gentle. "Grace. Grace Jennings." Recognition flashed in his eyes. "Jeremiah Jennings' daughter?" Grace nodded, looking down at her hands. "You know of him?" "Everyone within 50 miles knows of the Jennings family," Ryan said, his tone carefully neutral. "Your father has quite the reputation in Willow Creek." Shame burned in Grace's cheeks. The Jennings name was synonymous with trouble throughout the county. Her father's drunken brawls and crooked dealings were legendary, as was his temper. "I'm not like them," she said, a hint of defiance in her voice. "I can see that," Ryan replied simply. For the first time, Grace took a moment to really look at her rescuer. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or so, with lines around his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship. His dark hair was in need of a trim, falling almost to his collar, and a few days' worth of stubble shadowed his strong jaw. But it was his eyes that caught her attention most, deep blue and clear, with an intelligence and kindness that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. "What will you do now?" Ryan asked, breaking the silence. Grace hadn't thought beyond escape. The reality of her situation crashed over her like a wave. She had no money, no possessions beyond the clothes on her back, and nowhere to go. Her father's influence extended throughout the county, and he would not stop looking for her. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I can't go back." "No," Ryan agreed firmly. "You can't." He stood and moved to the window, looking out across the clearing. "You can stay here tonight," he said. "Tomorrow, we can figure out a more permanent solution. Your father won't find you here. My place isn't on any maps, and I prefer it that way." "Why would you do this for a stranger?" Grace asked. Ryan turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Because 7 years ago, I couldn't help someone who needed it. I won't make that mistake again." The weight of untold history hung in his words, but Grace didn't press. Everyone in the West had stories they kept close, pasts they didn't speak of freely. She understood that better than most. "I can work," she offered. "I'm strong, and I learn quickly. I won't be a burden." A small smile touched Ryan's lips. "We'll talk about that tomorrow. For now, you should rest. You're safe here." The word "safe" felt foreign to Grace, almost incomprehensible after so many years of constant vigilance. Yet something about Ryan Abernathy made her believe it might be true. As evening approached, Ryan prepared a simple but satisfying meal of beans, salt pork, and more of the cornbread. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a comfortable one. After dinner, Ryan insisted Grace take the bed while he would sleep on a bedroll near the fire. "I can't take your bed," she protested. "You can and will," he replied firmly. "You've been through enough today. Besides, I've slept on worse than my own floor." Too exhausted to argue further, Grace accepted his offer. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, with clean sheets that smelled of sunshine and pine. As darkness fell, Ryan stoked the fire one last time, then settled onto his bedroll with a book. For the first time in her memory, Grace fell asleep without fear of what the morning might bring. She woke to sunlight streaming through the cabin's windows. For a disorienting moment, Grace didn't recognize her surroundings. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up quickly, looking around the cabin. Ryan was already up, working quietly at the stove. The smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the small space. He turned when he heard her stir. "Good morning," he said. "Hope you slept well." Grace nodded, running a hand through her tangled hair self-consciously. "Better than I have in years." Ryan smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. "Breakfast is almost ready. There's water in that basin if you want to wash up." Grace took advantage of his offer, using the cold water to clean her face and hands. She did her best to tame her hair, wishing for a proper brush. Her dress was still dirty and torn from her flight across the prairie and subsequent ordeal in the quicksand, but there was little she could do about that. They ate breakfast at the small table, and in the clear light of morning, Grace found herself studying Ryan more openly. There was an ease to his movements that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin, despite the air of solitude that surrounded him. "I need to check on my trap lines this morning," Ryan said as they finished eating. "Will you be all right here alone for a few hours?" Grace hesitated, fear flaring briefly. "You don't think they'll find this place?" "No," Ryan assured her. "The Jennings men are hunters, not trackers. They might control the town, but the wilderness is a different matter. Besides, they'll be looking east, toward Willow Creek. This is north and west of your family's property." Still, Grace couldn't help the anxiety that crept up her spine. What if they do come? Ryan stood and retrieved a rifle from above the door, checking it before handing it to her. "Do you know how to use this?" Grace took the weapon carefully. "Yes, my brothers taught me when I was younger." Before she stopped, not wanting to explain how her father had eventually forbidden her from handling firearms, claiming women had no need for such things. "It's loaded," Ryan said, "but I don't expect you'll need it. I won't be gone more than 3 hours. Just stay inside, keep the door latched, and you'll be fine." After he left, Grace spent some time exploring the cabin more thoroughly. Ryan Abernathy lived simply but not poorly. His bookshelves held an eclectic collection novels by Dickens and Twain alongside practical manuals on hunting, trapping, and animal husbandry. A worn Bible occupied a place of honor on the bedside table. On a small shelf near the window, Grace discovered a daguerreotype in a simple wooden frame. It showed a younger Ryan standing beside a pretty woman with a gentle smile. They weren't posed as husband and wife typically would be. There was a respectful distance between them, but something in their expressions suggested a deep connection. Grace carefully replaced the photograph, feeling as though she'd intruded on something private. She wondered who the woman was and what had happened to her. Was this the someone Ryan couldn't help 7 years ago? True to his word, Ryan returned before midday, carrying several rabbits for their dinner. If he noticed that Grace had been examining his possessions, he didn't mention it. Over the next few days, they settled into an unexpectedly comfortable routine. Ryan continued his regular work checking traps, hunting, and tending to his small garden and the horses. Grace insisted on contributing, taking over cooking and cleaning the cabin. Her domestic skills were well developed, one of the few useful things her father had insisted upon. On the 4th day, Ryan returned from Willow Creek with supplies and news. Grace had been nervous about him going into town, fearing her family might see him, but he assured her he knew how to keep a low profile. "Your father has men looking for you," he reported as he unloaded his saddlebags. "They're offering a reward, claiming you're confused and need to be brought home for your own safety." Grace's hands trembled as she helped unpack the goods he'd purchased. "Did anyone suspect you?" Ryan shook his head. "I keep to myself in town. Always have. Nobody pays much attention to me." He paused, then added, "I bought you some things. Nothing fancy, but I thought you might need them." He handed her a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside, Grace found a simple dress, undergarments, a hairbrush, and a bar of lavender soap. Tears sprang to her eyes at the thoughtfulness of the gifts. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll pay you back somehow." "No need," Ryan said, looking slightly uncomfortable with her emotion. "Consider it payment for keeping my cabin so tidy. I've never been much for housekeeping." That evening, after washing with the new soap and changing into the clean dress, Grace felt more human than she had in days. The dress fit reasonably well, perhaps a bit loose in the waist, but the right length. She wondered how Ryan had guessed her size so accurately, but was too shy to ask. As they sat by the fire after dinner, Grace finally gathered the courage to ask about the photograph she'd seen. "The woman in the picture on your shelf," she began hesitantly. "Was she someone special to you?" Ryan was silent for so long that Grace thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, tinged with old pain. "Her name was Sarah," he said. "She wasn't my wife or sweetheart, though many assumed she was. She was my best friend's wife." He paused, staring into the flames. "Tom and I fought together in the war. When it ended, we came west together. He met Sarah in Denver, married her a month later. They were happy." Grace waited, sensing there was more to the story. "Tom was killed in a mining accident 3 years after they married. Sarah struggled to keep their small ranch going. I helped when I could, but I was working as a scout for the Army then, gone for weeks at a time. Ryan's hands tightened on his coffee cup. While I was away, a man named Victor Blackwell moved into the area. He wanted Sarah's land. It controlled water access to a larger property he was after. When she wouldn't sell, things got ugly. Grace felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. What happened? By the time I returned from scouting, Sarah had been intimidated, threatened. Her barn was burned. She asked me for help, and I promised I'd stay, make sure she was safe. But the army called me back for one last job, just a week, they said. Important work that couldn't wait. His voice grew bitter. I left. When I returned, Sarah was gone, the house empty, and Blackwell's men were already diverting her creek. Did he kill her? Grace asked, horrified. Ryan shook his head. No. He forced her to sign over the deed, then put her on a train east with barely enough money to reach her sister in Ohio. I tracked him down afterward, made him pay for what he'd done. Not with his life, though God knows I considered it, but I made sure he lost everything he'd gained. Last I heard, he was drinking himself to death in some mining camp in Colorado. Is that why you live out here alone? Because of what happened to Sarah? Ryan considered the question. Partly. I promised myself I'd never again leave someone vulnerable to men like that. And I found I preferred the solitude. People are complicated. Nature makes more sense to me. Grace understood that sentiment all too well. People, especially men, had always been unpredictable forces of destruction in her life. Yet Ryan was different, steady, reliable, and kind in a way she'd never experienced. Thank you for telling me, she said softly. Ryan nodded, then stood abruptly. We should turn in. Morning comes early. As the days passed, Grace found herself watching Ryan more and more, noticing the quiet grace with which he moved through the world. He was a man of few words, but meaningful actions, building her a small shelf for her few possessions, teaching her to identify edible plants in the forest, always ensuring she had what she needed before seeing to his own comfort. In his presence, Grace began to feel something she'd never known before: peace. The constant fear that had been her companion for so long gradually receded, replaced by a growing sense of security. Ryan never raised his voice, never made sudden movements around her, and always announced himself when entering the cabin. She realized these weren't coincidences, but deliberate choices made by a man who understood trauma. 2 weeks after her arrival, Ryan took her fishing at a small stream that ran through his property. The day was warm, the sky a perfect blue. They sat side by side on the grassy bank, lines trailing in the clear water. I can't stay here forever, Grace said suddenly, voicing the thought that had been troubling her. My father won't stop looking. Eventually, someone will talk, make connections. Ryan was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about that, he finally said. I have a friend in Colorado runs a trading post near Denver. He could use help, and it's far enough away that the Jennings name wouldn't mean anything. The suggestion made perfect sense, yet Grace felt an unexpected pang at the thought of leaving. I see, she said, trying to keep her voice neutral. Ryan glanced at her. It's just an option. No rush to decide. They fell silent again, but something had shifted between them. That night, Grace found it difficult to sleep, thoughts churning. The idea of starting over somewhere new was both terrifying and exhilarating. But the thought of never seeing Ryan again left an ache in her chest she couldn't explain. Or perhaps she could, but was afraid to acknowledge it. The following week brought unseasonably heavy rain, confining them to the cabin for days. They passed the time with Ryan teaching Grace to play chess, reading aloud from his books, and sharing stories. Grace found herself opening up about her childhood, the rare good moments before her mother's death, the gradual deterioration of her family afterward, the increasing isolation as her father drove away anyone who might have helped them. I always dreamed of escaping, she admitted one evening as the rain drummed against the roof. But I never had anywhere to go. My father made sure of that, kept me from making friends in town, told everyone I was sickly and needed to stay home. It takes courage to leave, even when staying hurts, Ryan said. Many never find that strength. I didn't leave because I was brave, Grace confessed. I left because I was finally more afraid of staying than of what might happen if I ran. Ryan's eyes met hers across the table. That is bravery, Grace. Facing the unknown rather than accepting certain harm. Something in his gaze made her heart beat faster. For a moment, it seemed he might say more, but instead, He stood and moved to add another log to the fire. The rain finally stopped 3 days later, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Ryan needed to check his trap lines, neglected during the storms, and Grace decided to take advantage of the sunshine to wash their clothes in the stream. She was hanging the last shirt on a line stretched between two trees when the sound of approaching horses reached her. Freezing in place, Grace strained to hear over the pounding of her heart. 3 riders, at least, coming from the direction of town. Abandoning the laundry, she ran for the cabin, fear propelling her forward. Inside, she grabbed Ryan's rifle from above the door, checking that it was loaded as he'd shown her. Then she positioned herself at the window, peering cautiously through the curtain. 3 men rode into the clearing. With a sickening lurch, Grace recognized her eldest brother, Frank, leading the group. The other 2 weren't family, but she'd seen them drinking with her father in town hired muscle, most likely. She considered her options. Ryan was at least an hour away checking his distant trap lines. She could try to run, but they would surely see her. She could hide, but they would search the cabin. Or she could face them, rifle in hand, and pray they valued their lives more than her father's approval. Before she could decide, Frank dismounted and approached the cabin, the other men following more cautiously. "Hello, the cabin," Frank called out. "Anybody home?" Grace remained silent, hoping against hope they might leave if they thought the place deserted. But Frank was already peering through the window on the far side, cupping his hands around his eyes to see inside. "There's someone in there," he called to his companions. "Check the back." One of the men disappeared around the side of the cabin. Grace heard the back door rattle as he tried it, finding it locked. Frank approached the front door, trying the handle before pounding on the wood. "Open up," he demanded. "We know someone's in there." Grace's hands trembled on the rifle. She had never shot at a person, never even considered it. But Frank was her father's son in every way that mattered: violent, unpredictable, cruel. If he found her, he would drag her back to a fate worse than death. "Last chance," Frank shouted, then nodded to the third man, who produced an axe from his saddlebag. The first blow splintered the edge of the door. The second widened the damage. Grace raised the rifle, aiming it at the growing hole. "Stop," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "I have a rifle, and I'll use it." The axe paused mid-swing. "Grace." Frank's voice held disbelief. "Is that you, little sister?" "Go away, Frank," she replied. "I'm not coming back." Frank laughed, the sound chillingly like their father's. "Don't be stupid, girl. Pa's worried sick about you. Put down that gun and come on out. We'll take you home where you belong." "I'd rather die," Grace said, and meant it. "You heard our Pa's daughter," came a new voice, deep and cold as ice. "I suggest you gentlemen get back on your horses and leave. Now." Grace nearly sagged with relief. Ryan stood at the edge of the clearing, his own rifle trained steadily on the group. He must have heard the commotion and returned immediately. Frank turned slowly to face the newcomer. "This isn't your business, mister. That's my sister in there. Our father sent us to bring her home." "The lady has made her wishes clear," Ryan replied. "She's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." "You kidnapped her," the man with the axe accused. "There's a reward for her safe return." Ryan's laugh held no humor. "Is that what Jeremiah Jennings is telling people? That someone took his daughter? Not that she ran away from his abuse?" Frank's face darkened. "Watch your mouth when you speak about my father." "Or what?" Ryan asked calmly. "You'll try to shoot me? I wouldn't advise it. I was a sharpshooter in the war, and old habits die hard." He gestured with his rifle. "Now, I won't ask again. Get on your horses and ride away. Tell Jeremiah his daughter is safe, but she's not coming back." For a tense moment, Grace thought Frank might challenge him. Her brother had never backed down from a fight in his life. But something in Ryan's stance, the absolute certainty in his eyes, perhaps gave Frank pause. "This isn't over," he growled, but he signaled to his companions to mount up. "Actually, it is," Ryan replied. "If any of the Jennings family comes near this property again, I'll consider it trespassing. And I protect what's mine." The possessive claim sent an unexpected thrill through Grace, even as she recognized it was likely just a tactic to make her brother leave. Frank spat on the ground before mounting his horse. "Pa won't stand for this," he warned. "Your pa doesn't have a choice," Ryan said. "Grace is a grown woman. She makes her own decisions now." The 3 men rode off, Frank glaring back over his shoulder until they disappeared into the trees. Only when they were completely out of sight did Ryan lower his rifle and approach the cabin. Grace met him at the door, still clutching his spare rifle. "They found us," she said, stating the obvious in her shock. "Someone in town must have talked," Ryan replied grimly. "We need to leave. They'll be back, probably with more men." "Leave?" Grace repeated. "Pack whatever you need. We'll take the horses and head out the back way, through the hills. I know these mountains better than any Jennings ever will." Grace hesitated. "Where will we go?" Ryan paused in his preparations. "I thought maybe we could head to Colorado after all. To my friend's trading post." He met her eyes. "Unless you had something else in mind?" There it was, the choice laid before her. A new life in Colorado, or some other path of her own choosing. Ryan wasn't assuming she would stay with him. He was offering her options, respecting her autonomy in a way no man ever had. "Colorado sounds good," Grace said softly. "As long as we're going together." Something flickered in Ryan's eyes. "Together," he agreed, his voice rough with emotion. They worked quickly, gathering only what they could carry on horseback. Grace had little to pack, just the clothes Ryan had bought her and a few small personal items. Ryan was equally efficient, taking only what couldn't be replaced: his father's pocket watch, his mother's Bible, the photograph of Sarah, and a small box of letters tied with string. Within the hour, they were mounted and ready to leave. Ryan on his chestnut stallion, Grace on the gentler mare he'd been training. As they prepared to ride out, Grace glanced back at the cabin that had been her first true sanctuary. "Will you miss it?" she asked. Ryan looked at the simple structure, considering. "It was just a place," he finally said. "Home is something different." The way he looked at her then made Grace's breath catch. There was tenderness in his gaze, and something more, a question, perhaps, or a promise. They rode hard that day, taking mountain paths Ryan swore weren't on any maps. By nightfall, they were deep in the wilderness, far from any trails the Jennings men might know. Ryan built a small, nearly smokeless fire, and they ate a simple meal of jerky and hardtack. "We'll reach the pass by midday tomorrow," Ryan said as they sat close to the flames for warmth. "After that, it's 3 days to Denver if the weather holds." Grace nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were doing. She was truly leaving behind everything she'd ever known, heading to a place she'd never seen, with a man she'd known only a few weeks. Yet somehow, it felt right in a way nothing in her life ever had before. "Ryan," she said quietly, "when you told Frank you protect what's yours." She trailed off, uncertain how to phrase the question. In the flickering firelight, she saw color rise in his face. "I said what was necessary to make him leave," he admitted. "But," he stopped, seeming to struggle with his words. "But," Grace prompted. Ryan met her gaze directly. "But I meant it too. Not that you belong to me, you don't belong to anyone but yourself. But I care about you, Grace. More than I expected to. More than I thought I could care about anyone again." Grace's heart thundered in her chest. "I care about you too," she whispered. Ryan reached across the small space between them, his calloused hand gently covering hers. It was a simple touch, but it carried the weight of everything unsaid between them, all the possibilities of what might be. "Whatever happens in Colorado," he said, "whatever you decide to do with your life there, I want you to know you'll always have a choice. And I'll respect whatever you choose." Tears pricked Grace's eyes at his words. All her life, choices had been made for her. Her future had been dictated by her father's whims and her family's cruelty. The gift Ryan offered, true freedom to determine her own path, was more precious than anything she could imagine. "What if I choose you?" she asked, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. Ryan's fingers tightened around hers. "Then I would be the luckiest man in the territory," he said simply. Grace shifted closer, drawn by the warmth in his eyes. When Ryan's free hand came up to gently cup her face, she leaned into his touch, eyes closing briefly at the tenderness of the gesture. "May I kiss you, Grace Jennings?" he asked softly. In answer, she closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, almost hesitant, but deepened as Ryan's arms encircled her, drawing her closer. Grace had been kissed before, awkward, stolen moments with boys from neighboring farms, but never like this. Never with this sense of rightness, of coming home. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Ryan rested his forehead against hers. "I think I've been waiting for you my whole life," he murmured. "I just didn't know it until you fell into that quicksand." Grace laughed softly. "That's not the most romantic way of putting it." "Maybe not," he agreed with a smile. "But it's true nonetheless." They reached Denver 4 days later, having taken their time after crossing the pass. No signs of pursuit had materialized, and with each mile that separated them from Montana territory, Grace felt the weight of her past lightning. Ryan's friend Jacob owned a successful trading post on the outskirts of the growing city. He welcomed them warmly, offering Ryan a position helping to manage the business, and Grace a job keeping the books, a skill she developed in secret, teaching herself from her father's ledgers. Over the months that followed, they built a life together. Ryan proved to be a capable businessman when given the opportunity, his honest nature and fair dealing earning the respect of both settlers and the local Arapaho. Grace flourished in her new freedom, gaining confidence with each day. They were married the following spring in a simple ceremony at the small church Jacob and his wife attended. 5 years later, their trading post, now their own after Jacob retired, had expanded to include a small ranch outside the city. Their twin daughters, Sarah and Mary, aged 3, played in the yard while Grace watched from the porch, a hand resting on the slight swell of her belly where their third child grew. Ryan rode in from checking the fence line, smiling as he dismounted. "Everything all right?" he asked, climbing the steps to join her. "Perfect," Grace replied, leaning into his embrace. "I was just thinking about that day by the river. If I hadn't fallen into that quicksand, I would have found you some other way," Ryan said with certainty. "Some things are meant to be." Grace smiled, knowing he was right. From the moment he'd pulled her from the clutching sand, their lives had been intertwined by something stronger than chance, by love, by respect, by the shared understanding of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed. The quicksand that had threatened to swallow her had instead led her to solid ground, to a man who showed her that love wasn't about possession or control, but about choice. Every day, she chose Ryan, just as he chose her, creating together the home neither had truly known before. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Grace Abernathy counted her blessings and knew she was, at long last, exactly where she belonged.